Hello, my name is Jordan Bowles, and welcome to my podcast. Today I will be discussing the Japanese internment camp of Tule Lake. Title of the podcast today is Tule Lake Conflict, Resistance, and Resilience in the Japanese American Internment Experience. One of the worst civil rights abuses in American history was the incarceration of Japanese Americans during World War II. The American government treated thousands of its citizens with extreme suspicion after the Pearl Harbor assault, which led to the incarceration of more than 120,000 Japanese Americans. As the segregation center for internees judged disloyal or unwilling to comply with American demands for loyalty, Tule Lake emerged as one of those camps' most controversial locations, as it was the biggest and most severe and harsh to their people. People were subjected to more surveillance and more severe circumstances in Tule Lake, where internees had to deal with identification and loyalty pressures while being watched by government agents all of the time they were there. An example of how state imposed segregation and loyalty tests compelled internees to face questions of identity, loyalty, and resilience is the Tule Lake internment camp, a distinctive location of resistance and conflict within the Japanese American community during World War II. My project makes the case that Tule Lake exposes the deep, long lasting effects of racial prejudice on cultural identity, intergenerational trauma, and the struggle for civil rights within marginalized communities. By critically analyzing the city's past and referencing Hector Tobar's observations on racialization and the immigrant experience in our migrant souls. Next, the first piece of evidence to support my claims is Makiso Hain. Hain supports the notion of imposed identity issues and compelled loyalty by providing background information on the difficulties Japanese Americans encountered during imprisonment. He states, quote, many internees struggled with their sense of identity and belonging during the loyalty questionnaire, which asked them if they would forswear allegiance to the Emperor of Japan. Some were forced to answer no as a rejection of a government that had forcibly detained them. End quote. Hain, 1990, page 570. This idea is paralleled in Tule Lake's loyalty test, where Japanese Americans were forced to navigate pressures to prove loyalty to a nation that had branded them as outsiders before and after these camps. For my primary source, this War Relocation Authority press release clarifies the idea that internees from Tule Lake were troublesome or, quote, disloyal, highlighting the state's involvement in creating a hostile involvement and an atmosphere as well. Quote, those at Tule Lake have shown a disposition to resist that justifies the high security nature of the center, confirming their status as disloyal. That is from the United States War Relocation Authority in 1943. This language underscores the government's racialized labeling of internees, heightening internal conflicts over identity and loyalty with the camp. Next, Rosalie Wax's magazine. In and out of the Tule Lake Segregation Center, Japanese Internment in the West, 1942 through 1945. The narrative sheds light on the long-lasting psychological repercussions of Japanese American internment, particularly that internees at Tule Lake faced a unique trauma. Their designation as disloyal not only separated them from the rest of the community, but subjected them to harsher conditions and lasting stigmatization within the Japanese American community. End quote. Wax, 1987, page 19. My argument on the significant effects of racial discrimination and forced allegiance at Tule Lake is supported by these statements, which offer compelling evidence of how the internment procedures imposed divisions, called into question loyalties, and left a legacy of pain and identity crisis. Finally, it is evident from the data that the Tule Lake internment camp is an effective example of the difficulties associated with identification, resistance, and allegiance in oppressive situations. Japanese Americans were forced to make difficult decisions regarding their allegiance and self identity in the peculiar environment of Tule Lake, which was characterized by the mandatory loyalty questionnaire, increased surveillance, and physical separation from other camps. The labeling of Tule Lake internees as, quote, disloyals, as Rosalie H. Wax points out, caused enduring psychological and social wounds, highlighting the long term effects of this division on both individuals and the Japanese American community at large. This analysis further demonstrates how the Tule Lake internment experience went beyond the immediate shock of forced confinement, leaving its survivors and their descendants with a legacy of intergenerational trauma and resilience, as seen through the eyes of Hector Tobar, Our Migrant Souls. As seen by the experience of Tule Lake internees who refuse these forced tests of loyalty, Tobar's thoughts on racialization provide crucial insight into how oppressed communities are driven to prove their value or commitment. Tule Lake's story highlights the long-lasting effects of wartime policies that excluded and scapegoated people on the basis of perceived loyalty and race. The fact that marginalized groups are asked to defend their identities against social prejudices highlights a larger historical trend. To memorialize individuals who suffered from such injustices and to guarantee that future generations are shielded from similar outcomes. Tule Lake's past serves as a reminder of how critical it is to identify and confront these systems of racist othering. The suffering of Japanese Americans during World War II and racial discrimination are profoundly commemorated by Tule Lake. The internment camp serves as a reminder of how discriminatory laws and institutional racism disadvantage populations, causing people to face intense emotions of loss, identity, displacement, and resiliency. Tule Lake's experiences highlight the profound human cost of injustice, as well as how people and families preserved, adjusted, and maintained their identity in the face of extreme adversity. Finally, I wanted to thank Professor Wade for creating this project. Without it, I wouldn't have been able to go and see this site and all of the legacy that it left behind for future generations in the Japanese community. All the pictures provided in the background of this podcast were original pictures I took from the Tule Lake Visitor Center in Tule Lake, California. Thank you again for listening to this podcast.